Ezekiel. We've come to the last in the series, the prophet Ezekiel. Just before Lent started, we began the series with the greatest prophet Israel had ever known, Elijah, who challenges the prophets of Baal upon the mountain and shows them clearly, as well as the principalities and powers of the time, Ahab and Jezebel, that Yahweh, the God of Israel, reigns supreme, and the other gods are pretenders. And then we came across Amos, uncredentialed, rather uneducated Amos from the backcountry of Tekoa, and what he lacked maybe in sophistication in his coming and going to the market. He saw a society in which the inequities were built in, where the hands were upon the scale when it came to benefits for the rich, while the poor suffered greatly. And even Amos was able to see with anger in his system that this is not what God intended. And any nation that saw itself lasting under these circumstances was truly mistaken. And so he preached the word, and years later they would remember, after the Assyrians had come and Israel had fallen, they remembered the words of the prophet. Oh, and then there's Hosea. Hosea, the loving prophet, who was called upon by God to proclaim to the people what they needed to hear, as all prophets are called to do. Hosea saw in his relationship with his wife, as the storyteller puts forth, her infidelity, her willingness to sell herself into prostitution. He sees in his love for her, his never-ending love for her, the love that God has for Israel. So even when Israel falls, and they do fall, God still loves and desires to bless these people. And then there was the aristocrat Isaiah. And we saw that Isaiah, in his time and place, he saw God high and lifted up. And he tried to say to the people that God was not to be trifled with. Or as I said that Sunday morning about the gospel music I grew up with, Jesus is not your buddy. That there is a holiness about God that needs to be honored. And then last week, Jeremiah, my favorite. My favorite because, as I said, he's a whiner. I relate so to Jeremiah. And in the southern realm, Judah, he was called upon to say to the people what they didn't want to hear. Much of the same message that Amos had preached to the people of his day, to the northern folk up in Israel. That there were injustices, that was unfaithfulness. And in this incredibly difficult time, this scarred person brought forth a word for those being judged. And even as the city was fallen, he found the capability of offering forth words of hope. Buying land from jail as a testimony that this land would live again, that Judah would be restored. Ezekiel. Strange. Ezekiel's one of the strangest people. If you've never read Ezekiel, you need to do that. It's why, when I was in seminary in the early 70s and we had those late night dorm conversations when we didn't really want to study theology, and the question that always got posed about Ezekiel, so what do you think he was smoking? He was the son of a priest. That was the problem. PKs are always the problem. Early on, apparently, when Judah fell, Ezekiel was amongst the early deportees. The people were crushed. They were carried away down near the Canal Chabar, near Tel Aviv. Harsh place, a wilderness place, a difficult place to survive. They had presumed that God would stand with them, be with them. They presumed that they were the righteous. And yet the Babylonians had come, Judah had fallen, And now here they were. Ezekiel had something to say that the people needed to hear, as did all the prophets. The people had assumed that God was their God, a provincial God. That God had been with them and gave them the promised land. And David had consecrated Jerusalem, an old Jebusite city, to say, here's where God lives. This is the throne, the city of God. And the people bought into this vision that they were God's preferred people and God was just their God. Now the Babylonians had carried them away, and now they were not only living in miserable conditions, but they were working under the burden. Well, if the Babylonian God was capable of leading them to victory over us, then Marduk must be more powerful than Yahweh. So what Ezekiel said was, if you start with the wrong assumptions, you're going to end up with the wrong conclusions. If you start with the assumption that God is this provincial God, just your God, only your God, then you're going to come out on the wrong side when things begin to happen. Ezekiel was trying to say to them, look, God is the God of all people, all nations. God can use these other nations, these other people, as instruments of judgment. God wants justice and mercy to prevail wherever. And the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, had been called to be the people by whom all the families of the earth would bless themselves. This is who God was. Sometimes we get to thinking that God is our God. Nation after nation has presumed that. God's on our side. That's always the recipe for disaster. God will not be boxed in. God will not be defined by any of us sitting here. The people of Judah thought they had it. They didn't. And now Ezekiel had to speak to them the word. You started with the wrong assumptions, and now you're struggling. You came to the wrong conclusions. Here's what's interesting, though. I remember being at a New England pastors' conference years ago, and I can't think of the woman's name. She was a professor at Vanderbilt. I can't remember what I ate for breakfast, so don't expect me to remember somebody from years ago. But she's walking through calls that people experience. And she got to prophet, and she said, and if you're called to be a prophet, God have mercy on your soul. And she just let that fall on people. But here's what's true, and here's what we see in Ezekiel as we did Jeremiah. The prophet is called to be a truth teller, to say what's uncomfortable, to disturb the waters, if you will. But there is built into the prophetic the pastoral. The truth teller speaks not because he or she wants to beat people up. The truth teller speaks because with a heart of love and longing wants people to turn from their ways. Jesus looked at Jerusalem with tears in his eyes, remember, and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would gather you unto me like a mother hen gathers her chick, but you will not." Talked about Jerusalem being a place where they would beat up the prophets. Ezekiel was one of those prophets in a hard place. But then he has this vision, strange vision. Like there's thunder and lightning, there is a chariot of sorts, if you will, caught up in the sky. There are wheels, but the wheels, the sets of wheels are at right angles. Isn't that something out of a Doctor Who episode? I should ask Anna and my wife. They would know. Maybe they read Ezekiel. There was a holy creature. Remember Isaiah encountered the holy creature. In this vision, there was an awareness that God was a God of all people, all things, all creatures. The chariot could go in any given direction with those wheels at right angles. It had the capacity, as God does, to be in many different places because we don't get to decide how God moves. We will go to the reference, the wind blows in many directions. The Spirit blows in many directions. Not only that, but Ezekiel had a vision of a new Jerusalem. And from the throne in that new Jerusalem came this body of water, this refreshing body of water. What an incredible metaphor for life in a desert place, flowing. He also had that vision that we know best, going to the valley of the dry bones, where a great battle had happened. Bones are everywhere. And in that moment, Ezekiel's asked, can these bones live again? This is an Easter thing, isn't it? And suddenly, Ezekiel sees this grand army being raised up from these bones. He sees a Judah that's strong again, with power, that God will be with them, that restoration will happen. So God is not just a God who wants to go around beating people up. The beating up process is that people live with the consequences of their behavior. But God is a God who's faithful, who abides with us in desert places and hard places, who wants to restore us as God wanted to restore the people of Judah to their purpose and their place. My Methodist friends in the Hokey Pokey group, yeah, that's what they call it. I couldn't have anything to do with that. Sounds like a bunch of retired people didn't have anything to do but think up that, right? And it's the Methodists who tell this story, and it hangs on with me. I'm always kind of chewing on it. It's about the pastor who came and he preached hard. Oh, just beat the people up. And after a year, the pastor parish committee met with the bishop and said, no more of this. You can't reappoint this person. I mean, he's killing us. Don't you wish that you were a bishop sometimes, Raymond? So the bishop made a new appointment. It came time at the end of the next year, and they asked this pastor to be reappointed, but the bishop had attended service a few weeks earlier. He heard how the preacher preached. He listened. And when they asked for reappointment, he asked for a meeting with them and says, what is this? I heard what got said that Sunday I was there. Your new pastor preaches almost the same way as your old pastor. He's hard. He works on you all the time. I could tell. I cringed myself. What's the difference? Chair of the committee looks at him and says, well, Bishop, the previous pastor, you're right. He did preach that way. But he did so, and he always seemed to enjoy it. The new pastor preaches hard, but he always does with a tear in his eye. I think that's a word in terms of the prophetic and the pastoral coming together. The prophets had a mission and a call and visions to say to the people, your infidelity, the systems you construct will not stand. That there is an inevitability in your vulnerability. There is built in something wrong. But so many of these prophets were pastoral, even whether they were aware of it or not. When they received the visions that God was not a God who abandoned people. That while people may dwell in hard the most difficult places, God is determined to be there and will always be working for restoration. How can we forget the words of the psalm? That beautiful, God's steadfast mercy, chesed, abides with us always. So, maybe you've learned something from the prophets. I've always tried to put it off on them so you didn't blame me. They were called not to lift up a crystal ball, but to read the signs of the time in the name of God and bring forth the truth and the word of hope. Don't ever feel hopeless. No matter how difficult the adversaries may be, never feel hopeless. God's steadfast mercy endures forever. Thanks be to God.